Okay, and I will tell you what this course is about. If you have taken a look to the handouts, you probably realize that there's going to be more material than we can actually cover, and that's precisely why the handout is long. My idea is that if we don't have time to cover something, at least you have that thing explained in the text, and we will not miss anything. My goal is mainly that we manage to have some discussion about the topics that have anything to do with argument structure in nonverbal categories. Okay, I'm going to be comparing theories. I'm going to bring out some theoretical problems that are just too big to cover in 1 week course, but at least we are going to look a little bit about it. Okay, from time to time, I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to ask you directly if you have any questions. I'm going to favor those people that are PhD students now. Okay, which doesn't mean that the other people cannot ask, but I will favor those that are PhD students taking this for credit or something like that. And if I don't stop and still you have something you want to ask, do it. Just start talking and tell me that you have a question, okay? Right? Good. So we'll start. I assume that you can see the PDF in the screen, right?
Yes.
Yes, good. Okay. So the initial thing I want to do is to show you that there's a lot of things that we don't understand about argument structure, okay? At least when I was a PhD student, at the very beginning, I had the wrong feeling that many of the things that I was interested in were already solved. And that was between boring and depressing, because then I thought there was nothing that I could contribute. So I want to start the course precisely by pointing out that we essentially don't understand anything about argument structure, okay? We have the tools to work out approaches at this point. I mean, we have learned a lot of things, empirical generalizations, the consequences of the theoretical choices and so on, but there's still a lot of things that we simply do not understand, okay? So let me start. If we think about argument structure, and the beginning is probably known to all of you, we think that we are talking about a type of semantic relation that is one between predicate and some sort of expression that at the end becomes a constant and is necessary to have a complete meaning for the predicate, right? So in one, you get a typical formula. So you take a verb like sing and you treat that as a predicate of an event, okay? That as far as it goes, given its meaning in a very broad sense, requires two participants, right? Those two participants are expressed through some kind of semantic relation between the event and some variable, right? Agent and patient in the case of a verb like singing. It's supposed to be only two for this particular predicate. And at some point during the derivation, you are going to satisfy those empty positions and you're going to end up with a description of an event that later on is going to be quantified over, is going to be existentially bound, something like that, which is going to allow you to talk about a particular event that involves singing and involves an agent and involves a patient, right? Okay, so what's an argument? An argument is some kind of nominal expression, in principle, that semantically has a relation with a predicate, and that relation can be described with what we expect is going to be a finite list of roles, things like agent, patient, goal, source, experiencer, etc., right? Now, on the syntactic side, we expect that thing to have some correlation, and the typical correlation is something like this. Okay, so if you are the predicate, syntactically, you are selecting or subcategorizing for the syntactic constituents that are going to play the role of arguments, right? Which means that you're going to project your label into some type of XP under which you're going to find the elements that correspond syntactically to each one of the arguments, right? So basically you look at two and you say, well, okay, so this is basically telling me the verb is the predicate. It is projecting the label. It's selecting one guy here, one guy there. Each one of them is supposed to be one argument out of the two that the verb to sing requires. Each one of them is expressed through a different type of semantic relation, and none of them projects its label above the verbal phrase. because you want the predicate to be containing everything that is an argument under it, at least at a particular level of structure. Okay, so this is the prototypical way of looking at argument structure. Any questions so far before I start complicating and making a complete mess out of it? Nothing? Okay, good. So beyond this, we pretty much know nothing about it. And there's at least 7 different dimensions where people have been discussing which one is the right theory from different theoretical frameworks. Okay, so let me start with one that you probably already know, and is the problem that I'm gonna be referring to as the granularity of thematic roles. Okay, so to give you a headline, we don't really know how many theta roles are needed to describe the grammar of argument structure across languages. So you open a book by one scholar and maybe you find 2. You open a book by a different scholar and maybe you find 17, right? I'm talking now, as you remember, about the name that the relation between the event and the participant receives, right? So things like agent, patient, and so on, right? The thing we know from the 80s is that something called the projection principle should apply. Anybody here knows very well what the projection principle is? Feel free to talk. I mean, just unmute yourself and say something if you have something to say, okay? Anybody knows the projection principle very well, or should I explain it step by step? I'll explain it step by step, okay? The projection principle is stated in lexicalist terms. So lexicalism, as you know, starts from the assumption that before you build your syntax, you have a very rich lexicon that contains entries for pretty much everything. It could be morphemes, could be words, could be both, sometimes even idioms, okay? In a way that building the syntactic structure is basically to project the properties that you have in the lexicon for a particular item and make sure that the syntactic structure is reflecting them, that the syntactic structure is satisfying those properties. So if I go back to 2, a lexicalist approach is basically telling you, this tree looks like this because you're using a verb like sing. Because you're using a verb like sing, this guy in the lexicon is telling you, I need 2 participants. The syntactic tree better reflects this fact. If it had been a different predicate, I don't know, something like give, the tree should be looking differently because give would have a different lexical entry that is telling you I need 3 guys. Okay, so the projection principle is basically lexicalist. The projection principle is telling you, well, okay, if you are listed in the lexicon as a predicate that takes, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, 17 arguments, the syntactic tree should reflect this and it should make room for the 1, 2, 3, 17 arguments that you have in your lexical entry, right? That's why it's called projection, because the idea is that you're projecting the properties from the lexicon into the syntax, right? So as you see in the reference is 1981. This comes accompanied, I mean, the consequence of this, by the way, I mean, it's pretty obvious, is if you're supposed to be in the lexicon a guy that takes 3 participants, you need to have in the syntax place for 3 participants. You have to create those positions, right? Otherwise, you are doing something wrong, okay? At some level, it was always unclear if the thing was wrong because of syntax, was wrong because of semantics or something else, but you are doing something wrong, okay? The second thing that was coming together with the projection principle was the theta criterion. So the theta criterion is basically telling you, okay, the thing that you are putting in your lexicon is something like the list of theta roles that you have to assign or the list of participants that you are subcategorizing, the ones that you are selecting, right? Once you do this, each one of those has to be assigned biunivocally to one different syntactic expression that was normally nominal, something like a DP, an NP, a pronoun, sometimes maybe a subordinate clause or something like that. But if you have 3 guys to give, you have to give each one of them to a different guy. No guy can get more than 1. You cannot assign the same one to 2 at the same time, right? So biunivocally, do you have 3 theta roles? You are gonna take 3 arguments in the syntax. Okay, you guys get this? Yep. Okay, pretty trivial. Obviously, in the current theoretical universe, not all of these things are given. Okay, so some of these things have been removed, some of these things have been reinterpreted. So let me advance already something that is going to play a role in this course, which is this principle is lexicalist. Let's call it endoskeletal. Maybe you have heard this term before. Endoskeletal meaning that the entity, the predicate comes out of the lexicon with a skeleton of its own, which is simply projected in the syntax. If you do it exoskeletally, right? If you reverse the relation between those two levels, and you say that first you are going to build something up in the syntax, and then depending on what you build, you are defining this many roles for arguments or not, then you are going to be called exoskeletal, right? So instead of saying, I take 2 arguments because I am the verb to sing, and the lexicon tells me I need 2 arguments, exoskeletal approaches tell you, you take 2 arguments because the syntax was organized in such a way. And once you have defined your syntax, you're going to put something there. If it happens to be the verb to sing, you're going to be pretty happy because you're going to get a correspondence between what syntax tells you that you should mean and your normal conceptualization of what it is to sing. If you put something like give, something is going to be off, and maybe you manage to solve it, you manage to accommodate that thing conceptually, or maybe you don't, right? So that's basically the thing that you're saying. But once we remove this thing from the table, this distinction between being exoskeletal or endoskeletal, you could argue that the current approaches still have a version of the projection principle, at least in the weak sense, that either way, if you define syntactically 3 positions for arguments, those 3 positions should remain always. In modern approaches, this thing can be called no tampering condition or something along those lines, right? Once you define something in the tree, you are not allowed to just remove it or deactivate. You can deactivate it, but you can just remove it. Okay, you follow? Yep. If we go to the theta criterion, if you think about it, this has 2 sides. So one side is, if you have one theta role, this must be assigned to only one guy, okay? And the second side is, if you are a nominal constituent that is going to behave as an argument, you should only get one theta role. Okay, so the first part of this principle stays nowadays. So the idea is that if you really have a theta role, it should be assigned to one guy and only one guy. So you cannot assign it to 2 different or 3 different guys, of course, unless you coordinate them, in which case you are turning those 3 guys into one single syntactic constituent. Okay, so do you understand why? Anybody can tell me why this thing stays? You guys want me to ask directly or I'm going to tell you, I'm going to do this also to make sure that I didn't lose the connection and I'm talking to the vacuum, okay? So let me see. Alessandro, are you there? So anybody wants to answer?
Okay, Antonio.
Yes. Alessandro, do you know, I'm asking you because I know you, okay? I'm sorry about that. Do you understand why this part of the theta criterion has to stay? The thing that if you have one theta role, you have to associate it to only one guy.
Well, maybe because if you assume that theta roles are directly related to a specific position in this,
yeah,
exactly. Then you cannot merge 2 different elements in the same position.
Exactly.
I guess.
And from this perspective, it doesn't matter if you're endoskeletal or exoskeletal. Because even when you are endoskeletal, you're going to think out, because of the projection principle, you're going to think that you need something like this, whereby you're creating one position for that theta role, right? We cannot have movement to exactly the same position for 2 different constituents. It cannot be exactly the same position. Some theories have multiple specifiers, but each one of those multiple specifiers behave differently, for instance, for purposes of C command, right? So it doesn't matter if you're exoskeletal or endoskeletal. The theta role is going to be somewhere, and in that position, you can only host one element. Okay, now, the other side of the theta criterion, on the other hand, dissolves.
Excuse me, Antonio.
Isabel.
Yes. Do you see the hands that people raise? Because
I just saw the one hand when you pointed it to me. I don't know how long it's been there. Sid?
No, recently.
Yeah. I see it, yes. Sid, tell me. I'm not sure I hear you. No, I don't think I hear you. I think there's something with your mic, right? Yeah. No, I'm sorry, I don't hear you.
Yeah, okay, perhaps he wants to write it down.
It could be, yes, in the chat or something like that. Yeah, it seems that there is a problem. Okay, so let me go on and I will get back to your question, Sif. The second part of the theta criterion is not equally important, and there's actually theoretical room to say that it's not a given that it should be true, right? The second part is, if you are one argument, you should only get one theta role. Okay, if you think about it, there is no theoretical reason to expect that. So what it would mean for for one single argument to get more than one theta role. So the thing that would mean is that in a tree like this guy might be able to move to this position. And then here you will have a copy, right? I mean, what you will have there is a copy, but still the guy would have been in the position for both guys, right? So imagine under certain conditions, this might have been a reflexive. I'm not saying this is the correct analysis of reflexive, of course, but imagine it could be something like this, right? So this second part of the theta criterion does not stay any longer. We actually think, I mean, some people think that it is possible for a DP element to start in one position where it gets a theta role and move from there to a different position where it gets a second theta role, so that the semantic entailments associated to each one of the theta roles just pile up and you get a lot of information about the role that that element is playing in the event. So it could be some kind of agent at the same time as some kind of patient, etc., right? So this is going to be a general background about what are the rules of the game. Okay, so just to give you some examples, I mean, you might know that the control structures, if you ask somebody like Hornstein, control structures do not involve big pro. They actually involve movement of a DP from an argumental position to a different argumental position, right? So this is one example. If you're familiar with Gillian Ramchand's theory about the first phase, that also happens across the board. You can get guys that are generated in a position where they are interpreted as patients, and from there they can move to a position where they're interpreted as agents on top of it, right? So you just pile them up. Okay. Now, if we think about this, okay, how many theta roles are we gonna need? So what would be your guess? How many theta roles do you think we are gonna need, and how are we gonna decide that? Okay, I'm gonna again try to ask somebody in particular. I don't know. Laura Ross, are you there? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Do you want to answer?
Well, yes.
Okay.
I think we cannot decide how many theta roles do we actually need, because it depends on the verb and the predicate.
Yeah.
And there are verbs that are more prototypical. So we take the normal theta roles, agent, patient. But then if we move to other verbs or predicates, the thing gets messy and confusing.
Exactly. So that's actually the right answer, which is basically we cannot know unless we look at the data. And when we look at the data, we are going to have to be very clear about what type of contrast we are going to take as enough for us to determine that two theta roles are different or they are the same. So let me give you specific examples, okay? Somebody like Doughty, he basically managed to explain a lot of facts just with two theta roles that he called proto roles, right? Okay, so little footnote. If you have a list of 35 theta roles, each one of those theta roles are going to have to be very specified semantically. If you only have two, on the other hand, you're going to need those guys to be semantically underspecified so that the context is at the end the guy that tells you how much, for instance, volitionality is involved or something like that. So if you look at about these proto roles, which are only two. So he's saying, well, okay, it could be volition, there could be sentience, there could be causing of an event, movement, etc., etc. So what does he mean by that? He means, well, okay, if you're thinking about the prototypical agent, you probably will find all 5 properties. But if you are finding something like 4 of these properties, it is not enough for you to say that this is not an agent. So you see, right? If you look at hierarchies of theta roles, which I assume you have already seen a little bit about with Artemis. So different authors are giving you different hierarchies, which basically depend on how many theta roles they think are relevant to consider, right? So Belletti and Ritchie give you agent experiencer theme, Fillmore gives you agent instrumental patient, look at theme versus patient, right? So one question we have is, okay, are they different? And I don't mean by are they different whether we can imagine some definition that differentiates them. I mean whether we can find some property that basically tells us that those guys are really different and not just different terminologies we are using for the same animal, right? So some people are thinking about agents and something like the effective causer. This F is an effective causer. Some people are distinguishing locatives from goals and sources. Some people like Van Velen are actually saying theme and patient are different, and they are supposed to be in different positions hierarchically, right? I mean, I could multiply the examples, but so that you understand the nature of the problem, think of this. How many participants can you imagine that are gonna be associated to the general role of setting an event into motion? So starting an event, triggering an event, something like that. How many of those can you conceive? Okay, so if you think about it, we have, of course, the typical agent, right? Which, depending on how you define it, you will probably associate to animates that in some sense have volitionality, they do something and they know they are doing it, right? Then you're gonna get something like causers, right? A causer being, for instance, I don't know, the storm broke the window. So you don't expect the storm to be volitional, to be sentient, etc., right? Then you will also have instruments, which in some sense we intuitively feel are different from causers, something like this key opens the window, the door, right? It's not like the key is the cause of the door getting opened, it's rather something that you use or some other entity uses to make the event start, right? And even in some senses, and for some people, experiencers of some psychological verbs like fear could be taken also to be the guys that initiate the state, right? In a particular definition of initiating the state. If you fear spiders, you could argue that the reason why the fear of spiders starts is your own internal properties, your own preconceptions, etc., right? So actually some people are putting together those 4 notions, right, which is agent, causer, instrument, and experiencer under one same label. So for instance, Gillian Ranchan is calling the 4 of them initiators. Other people feel that it is necessary to distinguish at least some of them. As you know, many people think that agents have a particular set of properties that are enough for you to say that they should be different from experiencers, causers, instruments, and all that, right? Other people say instruments do not really exist. Some instruments actually should be considered causers. Some instruments should be considered agents. Okay, so here's my question. How are we going to decide? So what is the type of thing that is going to let us decide whether we should call agent we should have a concept of agent and a separate distinct concept, which is something like causer? What is the thing that is going to let us decide between those two? Anybody feels like saying something about it? I don't know. I'm going to ask somebody directly. Zoltan, are you there?
Hello, I don't know.
So Zoltan, what do you think? What is the type of thing that can allows us to determine whether agent and causer, or I don't know, take whichever 2 theta roles you want.
Yeah, but I don't know if I correctly understood the question. So it's an empirical question, like
it's an empirical question. Exactly.
So are you asking about tests?
Something tests? Like that, or if you're, I don't have in mind any particular test. I'm rather thinking what would be the parameter that we would use. I mean, I'm thinking sort of tests, but I don't need you to give me any particular test, right? Okay. So basically what I have in mind is something like this. Okay, so if we want to define 17 theta roles, we can of course do it. But the question that I'm gonna pose you is, those 17 theta roles, are they grammatical or are they just different ways in which we can conceptualize reality? Okay, so remember this thing. We are talking about something semantic syntactic, right? So semantics plays a role. But we don't want our only definitions to be based on word categorization. We don't want to be in a position where the things that we are describing reflect more something like the way in which a particular language or a particular speaker reflects the structure of reality. We want to make sure that we are talking about languages, right? So we need something that is reflected directly on the linguistic behavior of those guys, right? So just to give you a very specific example, if we want to differentiate causer and agent, we'd better find some grammatical phenomenon that is telling us that the guys that we interpret as agents behave in one way and the guys that we're interpreting as causers behave in a different way. If we are not able to find a linguistic phenomenon that is distinguishing those two things, then we do not have any linguistic reason to say that causers and agents are different. Okay, you see the story?
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. For example, I remember Alexia Dou's course last day. And for example, she distinguished between agent and causer with voice P and little VP.
Exactly.
And for example, for her, it's relevant because in anticausatives, she claimed that there's a causer, but there's no external argument, so there's no agent.
Exactly. So in terms of linguistic phenomena, we know that agents and causers are different, at least in some languages, and I'll get back to this, at least because so-called adjectival passives pick causers but do not pick agents, right? Or because the behavior in nominalizations seem to be able to preserve agents but do not seem to be able to preserve a particular type of causer, right? So this is the type of thing we would need. Or if that fails, we would need something like these guys, I don't know, agents are introduced by this type of case marker. Causers are introduced by this other type of case marker. If that fails, agents must always be in this position. Causers must always be in this other position. I don't know, like an adverbial has to precede agents but follow causers or something along those lines, right? So I don't know, a phenomenon like, for instance, causative structures a la Kane, like the ones that Kane was describing in his PhD dissertation, are basically telling you, well, causer and agent need to be different because they need to be described by a different set of grammatical properties. You see that? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The same question could be posed about, for instance, patients versus themes, right? So some people define patient as an entity that undergoes a change of state. Some people define theme as the entity that undergoes a change of location. So here's the question. Do we know that these two things are linguistically relevant or are they not, right? If the test, I mean, if the thing ends up just being a definition, then we don't know that those two theta roles are the same, are different. They could just as well be the same, and the only difference is at the conceptual level, at a level of conceptual semantics, where they are talking about two different types of situations in the real world, which are not necessarily grammaticalized, right? So, I mean, you guys know this distinction between linguistic grammaticalization and the external reality, right? So, I mean, there's plenty of examples like this. I mean, something like poisonous. So the idea of whether something that you eat can kill you or not is extremely relevant for the conceptualization of reality. but there are no known languages that use this type of notion to define something grammatically. So there's no known language where poisonous things must be in second position inside a sentence, or where those guys get partitive case while everybody else gets accusative case. You see? So one has to be careful when talking about argument structure that one does not go to word conceptualization instead of talking about linguistics. Okay, good. So I mean, same problem is going to apply to non-verbal categories. So particularly with things that are introduced by genitive case, right? So if you read the descriptions, things like the father of Mary, the head of the school, the beauty of Mary, they have been described as expressing different types of relations. Therefore, because a theta role is a relation, different types of theta roles, right? And it's unclear whether we want to differentiate those also linguistically, or we are just talking about different notions that can be expressed with the same theta role. You guys see, right? Yep. Okay. So then, this problem, I mean, even if it takes us long, I want to insist on this problem. Okay, so when you look around to different grammatical theories and different linguistic frameworks, the role that you are given, the role that you're assigning to this type of distinction between theta roles varies. Okay, so there's some famous examples. So Jackendorf, how many of you have read Jackendorf? Is there anybody here that is working on Jackendorf's system? No? Well, okay, so I'll tell you a little bit. Okay, so this is different structures that Jackendorf proposes for guys that syntactically we could have referred to as patients of sorts, right? Patients or direct objects, if you want, if we don't use a terminology that is based on theta roles, but more like syntactic functions, right? And the point, I mean, Jaume Mateu has been working on these type of issues, and Jaume Mateu noticed already in his PhD dissertation, he noticed that according to these structures, the direct object of something like bottle would be something like the location that receives something, right? When you bottle the bottle is the place where the wine ends, right? In some other cases, the direct object is going to be something that is being used as the location where you put something, right? So when you butter the toast, you're using the toast as the location for the butter, right? And in some other cases, it could be the source, right? So if you empty the bucket, you are removing something from the bucket, right? Okay, think about this. At the semantic level, those three direct objects are going to be very different. But the question is, do we have grammatical evidence that these guys are distinct also from a linguistic point of view, right? It is not just enough that we propose different semantic structures. And remember, by the way, that when Jackendorf is doing his semantic representation, he's actually explicitly saying that he does not really care how much conceptual information is needed to give a proper description of the predicate. So his distinction between conceptualization and semantics is a bit different from the one that is assumed in frameworks like Mateu or Helen Kaiser or Borer, or I don't know, most of the people that are working on generative syntax, okay? So here's the question. Do we have enough grammatical distinction to say that those arguments should be called differently? Yes or no? You see, it's an open problem. If you ask somebody like Jackendorf, he's going to tell you, well, yes, because the semantic representation is an autonomous level that is distinct from syntax. I don't really care if this thing is not reflected in the syntax or not, because I'm treating semantics and syntax as two independent levels, right? If you ask somebody like Helen Kaiser or Mateu or Borer or anybody who doing nanosyntax, the answer would be no, because you don't because syntax should be the one that predetermines the structural aspects of meaning, and you don't see any evidence in the syntax or the structural aspects of meaning to differentiate between those elements. You guys see? So nothing like different case assignment, different positions, different options when you are extracting elements out of them, any type of tense or construction that selects only one of these guys and not the other, etc., etc. You guys see that? Yep. Questions? No? Okay, so ultimately, the theories are also gonna differ in terms of what type of phenomenon is taken as evidence to say that you have one or two theta roles, and at which level you are defining the different theta roles. Okay, so in the first part, for some theories, the fact that you need different descriptions to refer to something like a causer or an agent is enough to say that you have two different theta roles. For other theories, that would not be enough, and you would need some grammatical construction, some grammatical property in general that is going to differentiate agents from causers, and if you don't find it, then agent versus causer is not really relevant as a difference in theta roles, right? About the second part, in some theories, the distinction is enough if it applies at the semantic level, something like if I need to describe the predicate or the involvement of this participant within the predicate with a different type of formula from the one that I needed for an agent, then I have enough reasons to say that these are two different theta roles, okay? Like agent and causer. And for other theories, it's going to be, no, that's not enough. With that, you're only showing me that they are conceptually different. You need to show me something that applies either in the formal semantic level, something like the position of quantifiers, a scope, or something like that, or you need to show me something very syntactic, like passive allows it, passive doesn't allow it, this one takes partitive, this one takes accusative, etc., etc. Follow me? Yep. Yep. Questions? Okay, I'm going to stop 1 second so that you can think about it and ask me questions, or else I will move to the third problem. Nobody? Okay, so I'll move to the third problem. Okay. So third problem, and this is probably the one that people pay most attention to when they are talking about argument structure. So we already saw a little bit about this at the beginning. Are theta roles defined at the lexical level, or are they defined at the syntactic level? Okay, so let's think about it. The projection principle is clearly telling you the theta roles are defined at the lexical level. So remember, you have something like give, you have something like sing in the lexicon. This one is telling you I have two arguments, I have three arguments, whatever. When you build the syntax, you have to satisfy that. Okay. A syntactic approach would tell you the opposite. The syntactic approach would tell you no. Even if you access the lexicon before you build your syntax, which not everybody believes, at least in a particular definition of lexicon, what you're going to do is to build your syntactic structure following just syntactic rules. You're not going to pay any attention at that point to the conceptual meaning of the verb, to whether this thing is telling you something about transfer, or about producing sounds, or about painting a house or whatever. You don't care at that point about it. What you're going to do is you're going to build your syntax. You're going to decide things like what type of heads you are going to put there, what type of agreement you need to do, what are the movement relations, etc., etc. And once you do it, then you determine whether the combination of lexical item that you put there and the meaning that the syntax is forcing you to interpret are compatible or not. So ultimately, you could be building the verb to arrive as a causative verb. You could be saying something like, John arrived merry to the party. And if that thing is out, as it certainly is in English, you have to explain why this is out because of some kind of incompatibility between the things that the syntax that you have built are forcing you to interpret and what you take to be described by a root like arrive. You guys see this? You guys see this? Yep. Yep. Okay. So what are the things that in general are being used to determine whether the theta role is in the lexicon or it is in the syntax, which is ultimately whether we are going to be endoskeletal or we're going to be exoskeletal. So what are the phenomena that people are discussing here? Okay. So the first type of evidence is going to be any type of generalization that you can do about verb classes. So something like this. Can you actually say something like any verb that takes a direct object and assigns accusative case to it is a verb that has an agent? Can you actually say that? Can you actually say empirically that any verb that is describing some type of a transfer between one entity and the other, such as the other entity at the end, must actually get the direct object? Can you actually say that those guys always follow the same type of syntactic property? Something like, I don't know, can you always do the double object construction with those verbs in English, right? Given something like give, because you can say give the book to Mary or give Mary a book, is it true that you can take any other verb that describes some type of transference and make also verb book to Mary versus verb Mary book? Is it true or is it not true? So you guys see, right? If the answer to this is yes, you have a good point in favor of an exoskeletal type of approach, right? Because you are describing the productivity. I mean, you're describing the facts that you find without having to refer directly to individual lexical items. So you don't need to be talking about, for instance, the verb to donate or the verb to deserve or anything like that. You can establish a generalization that is based on a structural description, and you don't need to talk about individual lexical items. You see that? Yeah. If the answer to these things is no, then the thing is more interesting. The first answer would be, okay, then you're favoring the lexical approach. If you have to establish your generalizations and then start listing exceptions and say, well, this happens with give, but it doesn't happen with donate. Or this happens with eat, but it doesn't happen with deserve, right? Then the first answer would be, okay, now you need to be talking about individual lexical items. Therefore, you are favoring a lexical approach, because at the end, you're going to need to say that there's this exception, that exception, this particular root does it, this other root doesn't do it, right? You guys follow me? Yeah? Okay. Is this absolutely necessary? If you find exceptions, do you need to say that the approach is lexical? What do you guys think? Because if you remember, I started saying the first, I mean, it becomes more interesting. The first answer could be, no, now you need to talk about the lexicon, but I said it automatically. Although sometimes maybe you don't need to say that. Anybody sees what would be the way out without saying that this is a lexical problem? Okay, so let me do it more general. Is it true that any verb that takes a direct object gets an agent? Is this true? Or at least can get an agent? Okay, let's put it like that. Is this actually true? What do you guys think? I mean, you might know this, right? This is virtual general. Who's talking?
See if I fixed my microphone.
Okay, you fixed your microphone. Okay, so do you want to answer this?
You can have an accusative verbs, right?
Yes, okay, good point, good point. But remember, I'm not talking about, so what I said is you can assign accusative case if you have an agent, okay? So yes, I'll tell you. As you very well know, this is the famous virtuous generalization, right? Virtuous generalization, which is named after his discoverer, which was David Perlmutter, which says that any verb that takes a direct object should have an agent, right? And in the middle of this discussion, obviously, an accusative verbs came out as an example because they said, well, it seems that an accusative verb has an internal argument that could have become a direct object, but they don't take an agent. And that's the reason why this guy could not become a direct object, because you could not assign accusative case to it, right? Yep. So empirical generalization, it is not true that, okay, so it would seem that it is true that if you have an agent, you assign accusative. If you assign accusative, you have an agent, right? Okay. Later on, people have arrived to counterexamples to this, right? So one big family of counterexamples has been passive voices in some languages where even if you have a passive, you are able to assign accusative case to the internal argument. So if you think that the passive actually what the passive did was to remove the agent position, the fact that in some languages, like for instance, Icelandic, right? Or according to some analysis, Norwegian and Swedish, then it cannot be true. You have removed the agent and you still can assign accusative, so it seems to be a counterexample to virtuous generalization, right? Another case in point was finding stated verbs. Finding stated verbs that actually can assign accusative case. So I gave you before the example of deserve, because if I say John deserves a punishment, it's very clear that John could not be defined as an agent, at least in the prototypical sense, and it can still assign accusative case, right? I mean, you have a direct object. You see? So the story is, you have these counterexamples. There's also counterexamples to this famous double object construction in English, right? So donate is an example that people list as not being able to say something like, I donated Mary a book. That apparently is out. I mean, I'm not a native speaker, as you can see, but I read in the grammars that that thing is out. When give is fine. Okay, so it seems that at some point we might have to refer to specific lexical items. And here's my question. Is this the only option? Once we find that these generalizations are not as clean as before, are we forced to say that we need to treat theta roles and whatever they do in grammar as a lexical phenomenon? What do you guys think? Do you guys see any way out? Somebody talked before and I interrupted it. Anybody?
I think it was me.
It was you. Tell me.
What about instrumental subjects like, you know, the rock broke the window in a way. So I used the rock to break the window and then the rock broke the window, where you have some sort of argument reduction or theta role reduction in a way, but it's still higher in the hierarchy of theta roles.
Exactly. So your question has actually two parts. One of them is the one that we are discussing. So we know that it is not true that any single verb that has an agent can put an instrument instead of the agent. So we know it is not true. Not every single thing you can do with an agent you can do with an instrument. And second, it seems that at some point we are going to have to talk about removing arguments or adding arguments. Okay, I'm not going to talk about the second part yet, because how we do that depends on what we answer to this first question of whether the theta role is in the syntax or is in the lexicon, right? So let's go back to that thing. If we don't want to say that the fact that donate or something like deserve exist is a good enough reason to put all theta roles in the lexicon, what could be the other way out? I mean, I'm asking people that I know, because I know that if they don't want me to ask them, they can always break up my legs when they meet me. So, Ulises, what do you think? Are you there, Ulises? Yeah. Okay, so what do you think? If we find that something like donate cannot take the double object construction or deserve doesn't follow virtuous generalization, is the only option to say that we need to be lexicalists?
Well, no, it is not the only option. We can maintain the neo-constructionist or syntactic approach, I think. But in what way? I guess that at first we could have different options as features or some layers in a nanosyntactic structure or something like that.
Exactly. So without getting into details, if we are in a situation like that and we don't want to say that it is a lexicalist thing that forces us to refer to specific lexical items, one way out is to say, hey, look, the internal structure of verbs like give is not identical to the internal structure of verbs like donate. So if you're thinking in terms of transfer, well, okay, yes, it's transfer. But again, even if they refer to the same type of concept, it is not a given that they should be expressed by exactly the same type of syntactic structure, because we are not talking about concepts. We are talking about structures built in syntax with input to formal semantics, structural semantics, etc. Right? So that would be a way out. I'm not saying I have a workout proposal for this. I'm just giving you the options, right? Second option, The second option would be to say, well, look, it's mainly syntactic, but what is going on here is that maybe some individual roots are not licensed in the context of particular syntactic constructions. So basically something like, in the same way that arrive cannot be causativized, and we think it cannot be causativized because the type of thing that this expresses is not compatible with causing it into somebody else, right? In that same way, it might be that the properties of donating, once you provide explicit enough definition of what it represents, is not compatible with the meaning and function of the structure corresponding to the double object. You guys see? And again, I don't have a workout proposal. This is just laying down the options, right? But you guys see the problem, right? I mean, it's basically a problem. If you want to be syntactic, you should be able to establish your generalizations without reference to individual cases of lexical items. So it cannot be that the word for dog and the word for cat behave in a different way, right? If they are supposed to correspond to the same structure. If you're doing lexicon, well, if you're doing lexicon, you're going to have the opposite problem. You can only refer to individual lexical entries. So if it happens that you have 155 verbs of transfer that can undergo the double object construction, listing them individually is not a satisfying solution. And if you guys have read, I don't know, not just Jack and Duff in 1975, which was probably the father of this family of theories, but I mean, then you have Shelley Lever in the 80s, and more modernly, you get everybody working on construction grammar. Adele Goldberg, many people using that system. That's the reason why the evolution of this type of lexical approach has moved from individual lexical items to something more abstract, which sometimes is referred to as templates. Because even in a lexical approach, you realize at some point that it is not enough to be listing individual elements. What you have to do is to find generalizations over those elements, right? So if you read construction grammar nowadays, what they propose for these maybe 155 verbs of transfer that can undergo the double object construction is, okay, they correspond to a particular template. It's not a specific lexical entry, but a template, which is also for them part of the lexical entry, but with open positions as opposed to specific lexical items involved there. You guys see that? So if you adopt one thing, your problem is the exceptions. If you adopt the other view, your problem is the generalizations. You see? Okay. Second thing that is related to this, argument structure alternations. The cases I just gave you, the double object construction or causativization, are what people call argument structure alternations. So the fact is, many verbs, I mean, I'm tempted to say most verbs, only that I didn't count them, okay? But many verbs are able to have, let's call it, variable argument structures, following some general principles. Right, so there's a lot of verbs across languages that can be taken as, let's say, an accusative inchoative, like, I don't know, the TV broke, and also as causative. So causative transitive, something like that, like John broke the TV. So that's general. There's many verbs that can do this, right? And that takes me to the question that, if I remember correctly, was Georgios who posed it, which is, if you take something like instrumentals, it seems that when you are using the instrument in the position of the agent, in some sense, you're reducing one theta role. You guys see that? So it seems to go against the projection principle. Also, if you think that a verb like break is going to be basically causative, treating it as anti-causative, as an accusative, would mean remove one argument, if you believe in the projection principle, right? Do you agree with what I just said? Or you think that this is problematic? So, you know, anybody at all that would like to comment on this? Or should I pick somebody with my... So I think I'm running out of people I know personally and would not get very angry if I ask them. Okay, Luana, you have a question. I'm sorry, I didn't notice until now. Tell me, Luana.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Yes. I just wanted to ask you about verb classes.
Yes.
Because at least to my understanding, verb classes are a way in lexicalist approaches to form generalizations about this kind of behavior in the lexicon.
Yes.
And how can we account for them in a syntactic approach? How are these classes defined?
Okay, good. So this is actually directly related to the argument structure alternations. Okay, so I'll tell you. Verb classes, like any other classification, depend on what are the parameters that you consider to be crucial to establish the different groups, right? If you think of somebody, I mean, I guess that you have in mind somebody like Beth Levine in the 1993 book. Is that correct? Something like that? Yes. Okay. So when Beth Levine wrote the book in 1993, what she did in essence was saying, okay, so if I go the conceptual way, I am not going to be able to give you enough information for you to know that what I'm talking about is linguistics. So instead of that, what I'm going to show you to determine how many verbal classes and which verbs fall into which class is going to be the argument structure alternations. Right? You remember, so she's basically saying, okay, so I have here a class of, I don't know, ballistic motion verbs represented prototypically by throw, and I know they behave like this because look, I mean, they don't allow this type of alternation, they allow this other type of alternation. I can do a reciprocal in this sense, blah 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 blah. Right? Okay. From her perspective, this is lexical because what she thinks that she's doing, assuming the projection principle, I mean, what she's definitely doing, if she assumes the projection principle, is talking about families of predicates that for one reason or the other can undergo a lexical operation that removes one argument, changes one argument for another, reverses one argument or something like that. So she's conceiving those guys in terms of operations that happen in the lexicon, because she needs to respect the projection principle, right? So she needs the predicate to come without, for instance, the position for the agent before it projects into syntax, because syntax is going to be unable to remove the agent by the projection principle. If this predicate appears without an agent, you need that thing to have happened in the lexicon. And that's the reason why she thinks, okay, my approach is defining how many verb classes by how many different operations I can do with verb classes. In the same way that somebody working in grammatical categories is going to determine how many grammatical categories you have by the operations that you can apply to them in the syntax. Like you can combine this with that, etc. And from that you derive this guy is a noun, this guy is an adjective, this guy is a verb, right? Okay. So what's the way of doing this in a syntactic approach? Well, it's as simple as this. In the syntactic approach, you don't need, I mean, you don't believe in the projection principle in that sense. So those argument structure alternations are simply different syntactic structures, right? Which are going to be more or less compatible with individual lexical items by virtue of the type of description that those lexical items are giving you, right? So as in the example that I gave you before, arrive cannot be causativized. If you are syntactic, I mean, if you are exoskeletal, you have to find a reason for that thing to be clashing. You describe that as a clash between the information that the syntax is forcing you to interpret, namely that this is something that is being caused on somebody else, and the type of description that arrive is giving you as a lexical item. So you see. In a syntactic approach, you don't need a lexical alternation because you are doing everything in the syntax. The verb arrive or the verb break do not come out of the lexicon with or without an agent. You are going to build a syntactic structure with an agent or a syntactic structure without an agent. That syntactic structure is going to have different properties. And once that thing is built, you plug the entity, I mean, the element corresponding to arrive, break, burn, destroy, build, whatever it is. You see?
Yes.
You see what I mean? So basically, you don't have anything like a lexical alternation because you don't need it. It's just a matter of, okay, so in your tree, in your syntactic tree, which was defined with independence of any lexical information, did you project an agent or not? If you project it, that thing has consequences, but it's not determined by the lexical items that you are going to add later on. You see? Yep. So for some people, or at least from some perspective, explaining the argument structure alternations is actually easier in a syntactic approach if the argument structure alternation is general given a particular class of elements, right? The problem for an approach like this, as I said before, is precisely the exceptions, that all of a sudden donate is not going to be compatible with one of the two syntactic structures, right? And for the lexical approach, it's the opposite. So the lexical approach has to pay the price of positing an additional set of operations that you apply to elements before syntax, which is called the lexical, the alternations that are actually producing these changes in argument structure, valency, etc., etc. But once you pay that price, any exception can be easily accommodated just by saying, and this guy is an exception. And this guy doesn't undergo this operation because of, maybe you put a diacritic, maybe you put something else. You see the story, right? The problem for that approach is going to be the opposite. How do you generalize? And at that point is when the lexical approaches tell you, well, maybe you need something like a template. So if you guys have read, I don't know, that famous article by Jack and Dove, I think it was 98 or 99, something called like Dancing the Night Away. So that's one example. I mean, it's not a lexical, it's not an argument structure alternation, but the question is, what are the predicates that you can put in a context like direct object away? So what are the things that you can put in that thing? And his conclusion is, okay, so you need something like a template. It's not going to be good enough to say that anything can appear here as a syntactician would expect, but it's not good enough either to list individual verbs one after the other because you get some type of generalization. For him, a lexical generalization rather than a syntactic generalization or even semantic, but you get a generalization. You guys see? Yep. More questions? Did I answer your question?
Yes, sure, thanks.
You will, okay. You're welcome. Okay. We are surprisingly doing fine in terms of time. So look, to summarize this thing, okay? And let's go to the core of the third problem. So we have, in principle, for argument structure, okay? But I could be saying this also for grammatical categories, or I could be saying this also for aspectual structure, action chart, or something else. You can get a lexical approach that is telling you, well, the thing you're studying, arguments and theta roles, are actually predetermined in a lexicon that precedes syntax, right? Second option, you don't predetermine that thing in the lexicon. You're going to define those things in the syntax depending on which types of elements you add, what type of configuration you are going to want to build. And at that point, you don't even have information about the lexical structure you're going to put. So you don't really care whether you're going to have arrive, give, donate, or whatever. Those, for some people, are just roots without any grammatical meaning. You don't even know if they are verbs at that point. It could be a noun, could be whatever. You don't really care, right? So both of them have challenges. Both of them have advantages. I mean, because remember, we are talking about a debate between intelligent people. It's not like these people don't have any argument and these people have all arguments, okay? So the lexical approach. So as I say, this is the summary, 14 and 15. So the lexical approach is okay with exceptions, but has bigger problems when accounting for big generalizations. Remember, what do I mean by a problem? I don't mean it's impossible to account for it. I mean that in order to express the generalizations that go above lexical items, they need to introduce elements of a different kind. I mean, they need to posit another type of entity that is more abstract, something like a template or something like a big class of verbs or something like that, a la Beth Levin, okay? Now, for lexical alternations, in the case of lexical alternations, they believe in something like the projection principle, but whenever they find some type of exception, like donate or deserve, because their approach is lexical, and you know people that people normally treat the lexicon as a jail where people that don't follow rules are contained. The only thing to do is add a little diacritic to this guy, add some little kind of exception, that's fine. You can formalize that very easily in a lexical approach. There's no problem. It's completely kosher if you want to put it like this, right? And for that reason, any type of idiosyncrasy is going to be fine. Okay? Price to pay. You need a set of rules that modify how many arguments and what are these type of arguments. Therefore, they are generative before syntax. So instead of having one engine to make linguistic structure move, you need at least two engines. Something that happens before syntax and another engine that happens in syntax. Okay, so typical problems of redundancy, being more or less parsimonious about the predictions you're making. I mean, if you have one engine, your predictions are pretty clear. If you have 7 engines, your predictions are not so clear because maybe what one engine does cannot be done by the other, but the thing that this engine couldn't do can be done by this, and at the end you can do everything. Do you guys follow me? Yep. Syntactic approach, the opposite problems. Very fine for generalizations, problematic for exceptions, although again, there's ways out for exceptions. You can posit different structures for the family of elements that seem to escape the generalization, or if everything fails, you can also say that you have something like a specific type of root that can only be licensed in a particular syntactic context, something like that. I mean, at that point, it starts getting a bit uglier because you need to put also the diacritics in your lexicon, but it's not as ugly as other solutions for some people. Okay? All right. So just a little reminder. Non-verbal categories also have alternations. Okay? They are not so broad and they are not so widely studied, basically because nobody did like Beth Levin did with verbs for the case of adjectives or relational nouns or prepositions, but there's also alternations. One of my favorites is the one you have in 16. So some verbs that express psychological states seem to alternate pretty systematically. Sorry, I said verbs and I of course mean adjectives that express psychological states seem to alternate pretty freely between a structure that seems to be assigning the experiencer role to the subject. So John is sad, meaning John is experiencing sadness, and some other construal where it seems that the experiencer, if you want to present it, would be introduced like an indirect object or with a for phrase. And the subject is actually an entity that has properties that are enough to cause that psychological state into other people, right? So this is one that has been maybe the one related to adjectives that has been studied more extensively. Specifically, I don't know if you guys have read Pesetsky's 1995 book called Zero Syntax. So there's at least a whole chapter about these guys. Okay, so alternations also exist when we are looking at nouns, adjectives, and prepositions, okay? They're just more studied in the case of verbs, and maybe because they are more studied, it seems that there's more of them. I mean, but there's a lot of things that could be done with alternations involving adjectives, nouns, prepositions, and has not been done yet. So this is one example. The other typical example that has been studied is so-called evaluative adjectives. Things like cruel, nice, those also undergo some type of alternation, which we will discuss on Thursday, I think. And that's the only one that has been studied beyond this one. Okay, good. Okay, the next debate is a bit more abstract. Okay, and it depends on your assumptions. Depending on your assumptions, you might not even have a debate. Okay, so how many of you know what the UTA is, the so-called uniformity of theta assignment hypothesis? How many of you know this? Is there anybody?
We saw it with Artemis.
Oh, you saw it with Artemis.
Or at least those who attended. Perhaps not everybody has attended.
Georgios, what do you want to say? Tell me, Georgios. I see that you raise your hand, Georgios.
I think that the main idea is that you get specific thematic roles in specific points in the configuration, right?
Exactly. So that's the idea. Okay, so if you are in the 60s and you are working with the, I don't know, aspects by Chomsky or something like that, your entries, your lexical entries involving things like arguments and all that are going to look a bit like this, right? I mean, this is an oversimplification, but your entries are going to look like this. And the thing that is crucial from my perspective at this point is that you are basic. I mean, here, of course, you have syntactic labels. Imagine you could, instead of that, you have theta roles. But I mean, these are features. You're expressing the thing that you are selecting for as a feature, as part of the description of a rule that is telling you this guy wants to expand in this type of thing. And then you think, OK, so the verb to hit has some type of feature that is telling you I need an NP. So ceteris paribus, you would say something like a verb like sing is giving me something that is telling you I need a patient and I need an agent. And those things are features. OK, then comes Baker. In 1988, although the thing had been boiling since 1985 at least, when he was talking about the mirror principle on these things, and he says, well, OK, so it is true. OK, so let's assume they are features. I have nothing against it. But the fact is that those features are assigned in specific syntactic positions. OK, so let's assume that. But let's assume that they are features and you are listing in your lexicon, I take an agent, I take a patient, I take a goal, whatever. The fact seems to be that you are assigning each one of these guys in a different position in the tree. And he knows that, for instance, because C command relations seem to be pretty stable. So whenever you try to put an aphorus, the agent systematically C commands the patient, you cannot get the opposite, etc., etc. I mean, the typical facts. Even if I go to the first tree I gave you at the beginning, so if you've taken an introductory course to syntax, you would normally say, yeah, this one has to be the direct object, the patient, the thing that you're singing, and this guy should be the external argument, also known as agent or whatever, right? So we are used to thinking, since Baker, we are used to thinking that different theta roles are assigned in different positions. Up to here, all fine, right? I mean, everybody understands that, right? So the natural evolution of this is going to be, OK, if you're assigning the feature in a particular syntactic position, why do you need the feature at all? Couldn't you just say that, say something like agent is the interpretation that you're assigning DPs that appear in this position and you don't care? And you don't really care whether there was a feature to assign or not. You guys get that? So you have a generalization. The explanation of the generalization at the time was you assign in this position agent, in this position patient, in this position goal, etc., etc. In the same way that some people were claiming at the time, this is the position where you assign accusative, or this is the position where you assign nominative, or this is the position where you assign genitive. OK, so following step, why do you need the feature at all? Instead of a feature, you could just say, well, agents are here simply because at some point in the derivation, you have some type of translation rule that tells you the specifier of this particular XP is always interpreted as the agent. Something like assign an agent interpretation to the element that is in the specifier of this head. Assign a patient interpretation to the element that is the argument, I mean, the internal argument of this other head. Do you guys get that? Yeah. So somebody that gets it. What is the thing that we are gaining if we say that this is just configurations? I mean, we are gaining one thing and we are losing another thing. By the way, the thing that we are gaining can be divided into subcategories, and the thing we are losing can also be divided into subcategories. What do you think we are gaining if we remove features? Should I point out to somebody in particular? Let me see who's here. I feel like the Grim Reaper right now. I don't know. Alessandro, do you want to answer this?
Okay. I think that you are gaining a much simpler theory, no? Because if you don't need features,
yes. Okay. So let me be more explicit about what it means to be more simple. Okay. if you have a feature, you need 3 steps. You need to tag the feature on the predicate. You need the guy that you are introducing in the other position, I mean, the one that is going to be the participant, to have some other version of the feature, and the 2 of them have to match. You guys see that? So now, you could do it with very specific features, which is going to be a disaster. Some things like agent. I mean, that's going to force you to tag your DPs with features like agent, and you probably don't want to do that. But even if you just do things like Fancello, I mean, Gilbert Fancello in the 2000s had an idea about this, and he was using F. Even if you do that, you need to tag DPs with F, the predicate with something like an interpretable F, and then have a connection between the 2. So basically, you multiply things by 3, right? And by the way, you end up in the same situation where you were without features, because ultimately you're saying this feature has to be assigned in this particular position, in no other place. So compare this, by the way, with how other features work. So do you have a specific position to agree? Is there a specific position where you have to stay so that you trigger agreement in, I don't know, person and number with the verb or something like that? What do you guys think? Do you have a position for that? Anybody wants to say something? Ulises, do you want to say something?
Yeah, Antonio.
Tell me.
Can you repeat the question, please? Because I don't understand I don't know if I understood correctly.
Okay, so if you do this with features, the first problem is that you are multiplying things by 3. The second problem is the following. You are going to need anyways to have particular syntactic position where you're putting that element that is supposed to get, I don't know, agent, patient, or something like that. Yeah. So the question is this a typical behavior for features? When you have features that you discharge or that establish a relation with another one, do you need to be in a specific position like specifier of X in order to do this? So like, I don't know, agreement. Does agreement behave like this?
No, this is not the case. Oh, I mean, this looks like layers or something like that, like positions, but not features.
Exactly. So if we are in the 80s, you guys might have read that in the 80s, there was this belief that if you wanted to trigger agreement with something, you would have to move to the specifier position of that something, right? So this was, for instance, the old account of why the subject will have to move to TP, to specifier TP, right? But I mean, enter Icelandic and other languages, and you have all types of complications for that, and you realize that agreement can happen in long distance. A guy does not need to move in order to agree. Provided you are within the same domain, you're going to be able to agree in the distance, right? So theta role features, if they existed, do not look like this. You seem to be unable to say, well, the agent stays here, I put my feature here, and somehow in the distance, one gets the other, which is what happens, what you would expect to happen if you have case assignment, if you have agreement, etc., etc. You guys see the problem? Yep. So those 2 things is something that you have got for free, right? A third thing that you get for free is that if I give you the right syntactic configuration, you know that something is grammatical or ungrammatical because you are being forced to interpret something as the agent or the patient, even if the guy lexically doesn't have the feature. So I give you something like, I don't know, I give you something like John arrived Mary to the party, and you understand what I mean. I mean, you know that it is ungrammatical, but you understand what I mean. You understand that I'm in some way saying that John made Mary arrive to the party, right? So if you were doing this with features, it's more difficult to understand what is going on here, right? If it is a configuration, you're basically saying, oh, wait, you have projected John in the specifier of this element, and by virtue of that, independently of everything else, I am forced to interpret John as the agent of something, right? You see? So even non-word experiments could point in that direction, okay? Questions about this, or should I go now with the complications? Luana, tell me.
Again, I have a question about the information in the lexicon. I think because I come from a lexicalist background.
Okay.
But my question is, how can you tell what's the lexical meaning of a verb if different structures are treated differently in syntax?
Yeah, very good question. I'm gonna give you a short answer and then a longer answer. Okay. The short answer is that you really cannot know. The short answer is that within a system like this, what the lexical meaning is should be something flexible that is actually determined to a great extent by the syntactic configuration where you're putting it. So the short answer would be no, there's no way of knowing this, because this type of approach even denies that you could talk in a relevant sense about lexical meaning. Okay, so one of the principles that people treat in these exoskeletal approaches is that a root, something that you can properly call a root, I mean, something once you have removed any functional structure, any marker that is telling you this is a verb, this is a noun, this is an adjective, those guys do not have semantic information of their own, right? They don't acquire semantic information until they are contextualized by some head or heads that determine a particular grammatical category for it. So it's basically these root nodes are completely inert with respect to syntactic and semantic properties, for some people even phonological properties. People like Bermúdez Otero have argued that you cannot even apply a root cycle. The smallest cycle that you get is something like the stem, and the root alone is not getting any phonological operations, right? Now, a bit longer, I would say that there's a lot of people right now that are actually trying to find the connection between what is the information that you associate to a root in different contexts. Okay, so we still assume you need a different context to put semantics to it. But I mean, what is it that the same root in different contexts has in common, and whether it is possible to at least predict in part what it's gonna mean and what are gonna be the syntactic properties across those contexts in order to understand in what way the syntactic structure is coercing the meaning of the root and how flexible that meaning is. So in essence, the reason to do this is you want your system to block something like John arrived merry to the party, so that arrive is not flexible enough to become causative, but you want it to be flexible enough, for instance, to allow you to say, I don't know, John fell the child from the chair, which is more reduced, but apparently seems to be possible to interpret. You see?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's great.
Okay. Okay, good. More questions, or should I move on? Raise your hand if you have something. No? Okay, good. Okay, so I forgot to tell you what is a third reason that seems to be good in terms of removing features from this, which is that in a system like the Utah, or even if you are extremely lexicalist and you don't care about configurations, you always needed to establish generalizations about which type of argument was the one that was taking precedence over the others. So I guess you understand what I mean by this. If you have an agent and a patient, the one that becomes promoted as the subject is going to be the agent unless you do something before this happens, right? Unless you, for instance, build a passive voice, right? If you have a goal and a patient, there's also some asymmetries that have to do with the position. Now, if you look at the syntactic tree where, for instance, the theta roles are interpretations that follow from the configuration and not features, right? I mean, this is taken from Ramchan. this gets an automatic explanation, which is the following. The head that is giving you something as an agent is always higher than the head that is giving you a patient, right? Okay. So in a system like this, you're gonna probably need a bigger number of syntactic heads than you would need if you were being completely lexicalist, right? Because if you have, say, something like 7 theta roles, you're gonna need to have, if you count, something like 6 heads, roughly, unless you start playing with prepositions and all that, that are gonna tell you something like, okay, the highest one in the specifier I put something, and that's the one that gets, I don't know, agent. If causer is a different thing, then I need an additional head in whose specifier I'm gonna put causers. If goal is a different thing, I need an additional head in which goal is placed as a specifier, etc., etc. And then you go to the last one, and then you have 2 positions, one for the specifier, one for the complement, right? In an extreme version of this, you are gonna need 1 head per theta role, so that you can define the thing configurationally without interfering with feature assignment and all that, right? So if you apply a general syntactic principle, which is that given 2 things that are supposed to be the same categorically, like this DP and this DP, okay? If both of them could in principle move to the same position, in our example, spec TP, the one that wins is the highest one, because the 2 of them are identical. You cannot differentiate them by the features they contain. If they both compete to move to a position that is higher, the one that is closest is the one that is going to win, right? So if you have read syntax, this is also known as relativized minimality, okay? So by that token, you can always express something like which one of the theta roles is the one that takes precedence. In your syntax, because you are talking about configurations, the one that takes precedence is always the highest one. You guys follow me? Yep. Questions? Should I move? Okay. Now, problems of this. What are the problems of this type of approach in which we base everything in the configurations? I already advanced one, which is how many syntactic heads you are going to need. Okay? Do you understand that problem, or should I elaborate on that? No? Okay, I'm going to elaborate on that a little bit. Okay, so I have a tendency to take silence as I don't get it yet, so I'm going to elaborate. Okay, imagine something like you're talking about the verb to give, and you believe in features, and you're being lexicalist. Okay, with or without Utah, because the Utah originally was also lexicalist. Okay, so how many heads do you need? 1. You only need 1 head. Particularly in the theoretical universe where we are now, you are okay with only 1 head because you can have multiple specifiers. You are not forced to have only 1 specifier per projection, etc., etc. So you get your verb to give, and that one needs to project 3 guys, 1 here, 1 here, and then a second specifier. You're okay with 1 head. You guys follow me? Yeah, you get that? Okay. Now, imagine you want to say configurations. Okay, so how many theta roles can you actually express? Tops 2. Why? Because you are going to say, okay, I put 1 in the complement position, in the position of internal argument. I put a second one in the external argument position. But now, if I want to put the third one also as a specifier, how would your rule have to look so that you say the first specifier is interpreted like this, the second specifier is interpreted like that? They are both specifiers. So what are you going to say? Well, interpret it as a patient, well, I don't know, as a goal, unless you already have a goal below. It starts getting ugly. You guys see that? That it starts getting ugly? I'm not saying it's impossible to state. I'm saying, well, now this is ugly. You don't have a beautiful rule like the specifier of this rule, of this head, or the complement of this head is assigned this interpretation. Now you're going to have to start adding little additions to everything, a little addition, a little addition, a little addition. Now you have to say something like, yes, you're going to be interpreted as the goal if you're the specifier of this head, unless, and just in case, and if you also see this other guy, then you interpret it like this other guy. You guys see that? Yep. So at the end, you need to do something like this, which ultimately, in order to express 1, 2, 3, 4 potentially different theta roles, you need 1, 2, 3 heads, right? So your syntactic trees are gonna look bigger than they normally look. You follow me? Yep. I don't know if you guys have read exoskeletal and endoskeletal papers. One of the first differences that jump to the eye once you start opening one of those articles is that any exoskeletal paper has to give you bigger trees than any endoskeletal or lexicalist paper. And by lexicalist, I mean take people that also do trees in lexicalism, like, I don't know, Edwin Williams, whose work on argument structure, whatever you want. Whenever you are doing exoskeletal, because you are determined to explain everything syntactically, and you're going to privilege explanations based on configurations over explanations based on features, you are going to need to have more heads, and because you need a bigger structure, than any theory that is going to use features. You guys follow? Yeah? I mean, ultimately, the feature can be a lexical property. You can, if you're a lexicalist, you can list elements with the features that they contain. And the configuration is clearly a syntactic property that you don't get to see until you have built your whole structure. When you have built your structure, then you can say, this ended up being the specifier of little b, or this ended up being the specifier of voice p, or whatever. You guys get it? Yep. Yep. Questions? Come on, tell me. By the way, at the beginning, I said I was gonna favor questions from PhD students, and I'm afraid this might have been interpreted as anybody else cannot ask, but you guys can ask if you're not a PhD student also, okay? Anybody has a question? Or should I move on? I'm keeping an eye on the chat. Okay, so I move on. Okay, you guys see this? So, just to be specific, how many of you are familiar with Gini and Ramchand's theory about the first phase? Because that one is very clear about what it means to be, how you would say, based on configurations. Okay, some people might tell you it's not exactly on configurations. I'll tell you how it goes. So what Ramchand does is to split the thing that people would call the lexical verb in 2008 into 3 heads. If you are in 2018, you probably have 4 heads. But okay, we're in 2008 and we have 3 heads. And what you get is basically that the lower one has an aspectual meaning. It should correspond to a state that once introduced as the complement of a process, which is dynamic, like something that happens, would be interpreted as a result, okay? The guy that you put in the specifier position is the thing that people call resultee. Is a theta role for her, something that is grammatically distinct from patient, theme, and all those guys, right? The entity that ends up being the subject of the state that the verb expresses, okay? So one typical example that doesn't have anything else would be, I laughed myself crazy, so that myself would be the argument of the result. The entity that ends up being crazy as a result of too much laughing, okay? The one in the object position, I mean, in the internal argument of rest position, is describing you the state, okay? Could also be a predicate, not necessarily, by the way. Process, this position, the object position is already occupied by res when they combine together. So you only have available a position for what she calls the undergoer. The undergoer is similar to the thing that people were calling theme, in the sense that it doesn't undergo a change that is being measured by it. It is the entity that suffers some type of change that is happening on another entity. something like this. And the top one, again, the object position is blocked. The specifier position is the only one that you can use, and this would correspond roughly to the entity starting something, setting something into motion, which for her is called initiator, because she wants to put under that together agents, causer, instruments, and some experiencers. You see? So you need 3 heads. By the way, and this is a little footnote, you cannot use how many heads you need in a particular analysis as something in favor or against a particular analysis. Okay? So an analysis could be correct with 17 heads or wrong with 2 heads. The thing that you can use to criticize an approach is not the number of heads, but whether there is enough evidence for each one of those heads and the relations between those heads are explicitly stated or not. Okay, but in and of itself, having 17 heads or having 1 head should not count as better or worse. Okay, in theoretical syntax, if you're doing something like acquisition, maybe you want to use it as an argument of plausibility, but plausible is not necessarily correct and implausible is not necessarily wrong. Okay, you guys follow this? Yep. Say something. I want to make sure that, I'm going to take a sip of water and I will give you time to think if you want to say something, okay? Luana, tell me.
I have 2 questions about this type of representation. First,
you mean the 3? This type of 3 or what?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Is there any problem in having many empty categories?
Oh, okay, good question. No, this is not empty categories, at least not necessarily. That part is independent. It has to do with spell out, and you could assume that you have a head here that has phonological shape, right? A morphophonological exponent, and it moves here by head movement and picks it, and moves here by head movement and picks it, right? So that's perfectly compatible with this theory. Or you could say, what Gillian Ramchan does is something called spanning, which is that these 3 heads, when they're in a sequence, they're spelled out by an exponent altogether, right? So you don't need the thing to be 0. You can also use what people call, I forget always which one is, synthetic expression. You can also use one morpheme that spells out the 3 elements at the same time through different technical devices. Head movement, spanning, phrasal spell out. There's a long list of things that you can do. Okay, yep.
Okay, and a second question is whether you can have any distinction in the nature of these semantic heads and other heads that are essentially syntactic, like agreement and others. I don't know.
Very good question. So this is a very general question that depends a lot on your theoretical assumptions. But right now, people that do syntax don't like to believe in general in heads that lack absolutely any type of semantic import. So things like agreement phrase, like we conceived that in the early 90s, they are not allowed any longer. So you cannot have things like just agreement and this doesn't have any meaning. Everything that you put in the syntactic tree should make a contribution to semantics. That one is almost settled as a theoretical desideratum. You cannot propose heads without semantic import. And for some people, to phonology. For some people, 0 is not allowed. Although that one is more controversial. That one is not generally the case. Tell me, Luana.
Okay. No, that's it. That's it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. You're welcome. You're welcome. Okay, 19 minutes. I think we are even going to be able to finish this. Okay. So just to give you a taste of what we will discuss on Wednesday, this question about features versus configurations also applies to the case of nonverbal categories. So I'll give you one simple example from Spanish. It is not normally the case in Spanish that you can have a noun phrase with more than one modifier introduced by the preposition of. but there is a particular family of nouns that allow it, and those are called representation nouns, things like portrait, translation, etc., etc. Okay. When you have one of those guys, right, and then you can have three. So you can say the portrait of Charles IV, of Goya, that would be by Goya in English, of the Museum of the Prado, that would be at or in the Museum of the Prado, right? But in Spanish, you can do it with of. And what we see is that the guy that is being interpreted as, I mean, you have no way of distinguishing by the type of preposition which role it has. But what we know is that the first one, the one that is closest configurationally, is the one that denotes the represented entity. The second one is the one that denotes the author of the representation, and the most external one is the one that denotes the location or the owner in general terms of the representation. There's no way of changing that. So the hierarchy we show is something like this. The lowest one is representee, then author, then possessor. And you can test that by trying to apply pronominalization with a possessive to each one of these. So this also happens in nonverbal categories, as we would expect if theta roles are configurations, because the configuration at the end is going to be the same, specifier of, complement of. Not so obvious if this was features. It's not so obvious that we should find the same thing in nonverbal categories if the explanation was features. You guys know why? Do you see why? Anybody? Anybody wants to tell me? I'll tell you why. If it is features, remember that the feature is listed in a lexical item. There's nothing telling you that the features for a noun and the features for a verb should be different or the same, right? If you take something like portrait, maybe you can try to say that there is a verb below it. It comes from to take a portrait or something like that. But this could have been photo. That does not have any connection with any verb. If photo needs to have exactly the same features as a verbal predicate in order to explain this, it seems that we might be missing a generalization. It could have been in completely different terms. We don't need, if we are talking about features, that nouns and verbs have exactly the same type of features. But if we are talking about configurations, both of them eventually are going to give rise to basically the same configurations because you have complement of and specifier of. You guys see that? Yep. OK, good. Then the final problems are very simple. So you guys know that we have arguments and we have adjuncts. Anybody can give me a textbook definition of adjunct as opposed to argument? Let me ask somebody that knows a lot about semantics. Ulises, do you want to give me a definition of adjunct?
Maybe we could define an adjunct as a modifier that does not change the semantic type.
Okay. In a technical definition, yes. Let's call it some type of expression that when you add it to another expression, it does not change in any substantial way the denotation of that entity, right? As opposed to an argument. So if you take a predicate, as we saw in one at the very beginning, so this formula is basically telling you, whenever you put up an argument, you're changing substantially the denotation of the whole, because now you have removed one of the open positions. When you put the other element, you remove the second open position, and at the end you end up with the denotation of just an event. It's not an open formula, but you're just now an event. And once the event gets located in time and space and world, then you're talking about a particular description, blah, 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 right? If you are an adjunct, you're not changing anything from this denotation. So you can take this guy, start combining adjunct after adjunct, and provided you don't put any agent and no patient, this formula is not going to change. You will still have two open positions. You see that? OK. So in more pedestrian terms, the adjunct is assigned for free. You can have it or not have it. It's not going to affect the grammaticality of what you get. the argument might affect grammatically. So some verbs are going to require overt arguments. Some operations require a particular type of argument. To the best of our knowledge, there is nothing that is telling you need an adjunct for this. Not 100% true. There's a few funny cases, but that's part of the question. Okay, so if we do this, then we are defining argument as compulsory and adjunct as non-compulsory. And as you can imagine, depending on the cases we look at, this is far from obvious. It's far from obvious what it means to be compulsory and not compulsory. Because if you remember, you can take verbs like drink, where you can just remove milk, and it's going to be fine grammatically. Maybe it means something slightly different, but it is okay grammatically, right? So, you know, for some people, you just remove the internal argument. For some other people, you are putting an empty category in the position of the internal argument, etc., etc. But at least there is a way of looking at this where you see, well, okay, milk was not really compulsory with drink. And then there's other verbs where you absolutely need to put the internal argument, right? Destroy my life, you cannot say John destroyed. You see, just to give an example. So things are not so obvious once we start combining this with prepositions. Because, okay, take something like this. John lives in Boston. In Boston is a locative that you might want to say is completely argumental. Do we agree with this? That John lives in Boston looks more like an argument, like an adjunct? You guys see that? So reason, remove
yes.
John lives. Sorry, what?
Yes.
Yes, okay, okay, good. So you remove it, either it's a word salad or the meaning of the predicate changed in a very radical way. Okay, now you say that John is alive. Okay, now here's the problem. If we take this thing to be an argument, what is it an argument of? Boston seems to be an argument of in, and what seems to be the argument for live is in Boston. You guys see that? So the preposition seems to have a double role here. In a sense, it is defining some type of theta role. I mean, it's obvious that this is a locative in part because we are using in and not, I don't know, with, right? And in the other sense, it is Boston that is, Boston is not an argument of live, but actually an argument of the preposition. You guys see that, right? Yeah. So it's not so clear from this perspective what it means to be I mean, it's not so clear that something like I am compulsory and I am not compulsory is going to give us enough information to determine if something is an argument or an adjunct. And because of that, when you look at the literature, you get plenty of cases, typically involving directionals, where you don't know exactly if the thing you are treating is an adjunct or an argument. So something like John arrived to the party in some analysis looks a lot like an adjunct. In other analysis, it looks a lot like an argument. You see the problem? I mean, that's more like an analytical problem for specific cases. When we are in nonverbal categories, this problem that is maybe a little bit subtle with verbs multiplies. So take this, the father of Mary. It seems that we can remove of Italy for the president, but it's not so easy to remove of Mary when we talk about the father. Does this mean that of Mary is an argument and of Italy is an adjunct? So that's a question. When we look at something like the war of the Greeks against the Ottomans, how do we know that these guys are adjuncts or arguments? We'll talk about this on Wednesday, okay? One way of looking at this is that these guys are actually arguments. Another way of looking at this is that they are not really arguments, they are just modifiers, and they happen to look like agents or patients simply because of what the noun means, without any syntactic import on the status of these elements. Okay? So we could multiply this. Okay. I had something about case here, but I'm gonna remove it. You can read it on your own. It's not gonna be something crucial in the discussion that is gonna follow in the next days, right? And the last thing is a bit more subtle. I want to mention it, but again, it's not something that is going to play a big role in the things that we are going to be looking at in the following days. The question is, what are the categories that can act as arguments? So The consensus is, if you are a DP, you can be an argument. The question is, how many other things can be arguments? And here the problem is, number one, when you have a subordinate clause, can that thing also be an argument? Or you're not being an argument? So traditional view, they are arguments. And then you talk about verbs that actually select for a subordinate clause as internal argument. I don't know, like say that John, blah, blah, blah. But there's other views where that guy is not really an argument. The only type of argument you can have is a nominal expression, not a subordinate clause. And those guys are actually modifiers of that nominal expression, which is something like the claim, the thought, the proposal, etc., which is covered, right? Another typical place, as I mentioned already, is whether prepositions are arguments. So the role of prepositions is ambiguous in this type of system. It's going to be even more ambiguous when we look at adjectives and we look at nouns, as you will see in the following days. Non-referential entities. That's another question. If you have something that looks a lot like an NP or a non-referential thing like to weigh 3 kilos, in what sense are you actually an argument of the predicate? Right? You're not referential. You're not talking about 3 specific kilos that you weigh. You're talking about a quantity. You're measuring it. In what sense is this an argument? And if it is an argument, how does that fit with the typical semantic proposal, the typical semantic intuition about what counts as a participant, right? I could say the same about verb NPs. Something like John does not eat meat, where meat doesn't have any determiner, and you're talking in general about it, even in a Romance language. Is that an argument? Is that part of the predicate? Are you restricting the predicate? Or are you actually assigning a different theta role to it? Is this a participant, etc., right? I mean, there's a long tradition of questions about it in the semantic literature. Okay, relational adjectives are another case in point, but okay. So just to finish, okay, to introduce what we are going to see tomorrow and what is going to be the discussion tomorrow. One view of which categories can take arguments is the following. The only category that really takes arguments is the verb. This is, for instance, what Helen Kaiser say. Well, I mean, the verb and the preposition are the only two elements that can take proper arguments, right? The preposition, because it expresses a relation between two entities, so you need the two entities to be complete in meaning, and the verb, because it always takes, in one sense or the other, it always takes an internal entity that is co-defining with the verb some type of action, right? But once you move out from here, in many theories...
Sorry.
Tell me, Georgios.
Isn't that what Baker uses to distinguish verbs from nouns, the fact that they can take arguments?
Yes and no. I'll get back to this tomorrow, okay? I will get back to this tomorrow because the short answer is yes, but that can be misleading. So I'll get back. Okay, so the verb is supposed to take the argument, the preposition is supposed to take the argument, the noun should not be able to take any argument of any type, and the adjective semantically needs an argument because it is a predicate, but syntactically it is unable to get that argument. So it has to become parasitic on another category so that the other category, a preposition or a verb, gives the adjective the position to put the argument. You guys see that? You follow? I mean, I will start here tomorrow as a summary, but I mean, the thing is that the theoretical investigations that are being done since 1995, something like that, seem to point out to the conclusion that not any type of lexical category can take arguments. That in a very significant sense, it is going to be verbs and prepositions where the preposition is going to have an ambiguous role, the only ones that can actually take arguments.
So can I ask a question about that?
Let me finish the sentence and I will attend your question, okay?
Thank you.
So whenever you have a noun or an adjective, either you don't get arguments, meaning the things that seem to be arguments should not be there or should not be arguments, or you are introducing more complex structure that is actually habilitating the argument positions for the category that should not have arguments. Okay, so the idea is tomorrow we are going to be talking about why should it be the case that verbs are the ones that take arguments and what is a noun or an adjective missing to take an argument. On Wednesday, we'll talk about apparent arguments in nouns and we'll conclude that probably they never take arguments and the cases that seem to involve taking arguments are surface appearances that are not really systematic. On Thursday, we'll talk about adjectives, and on Friday, we'll talk about prepositions. Okay, so that's the plan. Sid, tell me.
So you'll probably go over event nominals on Wednesday, right?
I will do that, exactly.
Okay, so what about inalienable nouns that do encode the possessor in their lexical, yeah.
Yeah. That's also gonna be Wednesday. The answer I'm gonna give you, I mean, I'm gonna present it as a problem, right? But if you ask me what do I think the same as Abjar. There is an argument, but it is not an argument of the noun. So you actually have to build additional structure for that. Okay, guys, I see we have something like 100 seconds before we finish today. Any question? Or shall we go? Tell me. Nothing?
Antonio, I had a question, but I can also search it on my own. It's regarding Ramchand's tree. You said that there was an extra head added in a newer version of her theory.
Yes, the so-called event phrase.
Event phrase, okay.
Which plays a role that is similar to the one that voice P does for Harley and other people. But only that it has a more precise role in Ramchand. It's supposed to be the one that tags the event with temporal and word parameters.
Okay, thank you.
I don't know if we'll have time to talk about it, but maybe tomorrow. Okay, yep.
Okay, it seems it's time. If there isn't any other question, you can ask it now, or if not, just wait until tomorrow.
Or tomorrow. I mean, it's not like a wedding where you have to be silent forever.
Yeah.